So when talking about Dungeons and Dragons, or any RPG, have you ever heard somebody use terms like tank or control and not really know what they're talking about? Have you ever been frustrated because you picked a character class or you built a character, and the way their abilities perform isn't how you expected? In today's video, we're going to be clearing a lot of that up by talking about the 4 rules of combat in a 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons game. Hi everybody, my name is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. So we're about at the halfway point now in our class evaluation video series. So today we're going to be taking a break and instead looking at the 4 rules of combat in Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this is a topic I actually covered pretty early on in this YouTube channel, but that video was really rough and the ideas needed some revision, so this is kind of take 2 on that topic. Now, the idea of 4 roles in combat really means that if you take a character's actions or a character's choices, really the primary motivation can be boiled down to one of 4 different categories. Now, different tables and different play groups are going to have different terms for these 4 categories. And 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons even tried to integrate this in some of its in-game lore. While the function of these categories is pretty consistent table to table, the individual terms your table prefers may be different than what I use. So to clear up some terms that I use in the class evaluation series, and the terms I tend to use as we move forward with this channel, the 4 rules of combat are DPR, tank, support, and control. So to explain them, let's start with the easiest, DPR, which stands for damage per round. The term comes from DPS, which is an MMO term for damage per second, but because Dungeons & Dragons has its action economy in rounds as opposed to real time, we changed it for our table to DPR. Now, DPR characters, or a character making a DPR decision, is trying to maximize the amount of damage it can make in a round. Now, factors that go into a DPR decision include your attack bonus, your damage type, and of course the amount of damage that you can deal. Now, an attack bonus is important because it doesn't matter how much damage you deal if the attack doesn't hit. Now, damage type is important because it doesn't matter how often you hit or how hard you hit if the creature that you're hitting is resistant or immune to the damage type you're dealing. Now, DPR-focused characters will either have a few different damage types that they can switch between, or they rely on a rarely resisted to damage type, like Force or Psychic. Or they use magical weapons often, because creatures that are resistant to those physical damage types usually aren't resistant to magical weapons. And of course, the amount of damage you're dealing matters too. A DPR character might do things like calculate the minimum amount of damage that they deal versus the maximum and how likely they are to deal a certain amount of damage. For DPR players, a lot of times being able to deal consistent, reliable damage is better than gambling on trying to deal a high amount for one turn. Now, any character can deal damage, but there are classes with specific features that allow them to deal a higher amount of damage more consistently and efficiently than other classes. Examples of this include Paladins, Rogues, and Warlocks. Paladins, because of their Divine Smite, their ability to convert spell slots to raw damage. Rogues, because of Sneak Attack, an ability that allows them to deal more weapon damage that stacks as they invest in rogue levels. And Warlock, because of the infamous Eldritch Blast, and because that attack deals force damage, which is almost never immune or resisted to in 5th edition's rules. So, the next role on our list is the tank. If DPR characters are built to deal damage, tanks are meant to take damage. As part of this, tank players look for features that give their characters more durability and survivability, so that they can take as much damage as they can, so that that damage isn't being allocated to their squishier party members. So whereas a DPR character looks for a high attack bonus, damage type, and amount of damage they can deal, a tank character is looking for a high armor class, a high constitution score, and different damage resistances. So whereas a high attack bonus means you hit more often, a high armor class means you are getting hit less often. Even if you're being targeted, if the attacks don't land, that's that much less damage you're not taking and your party members aren't taking. Now, a high constitution also means high hit points, and it means that it's easier for you to make constitution saves, which are extremely deadly in 5th edition's design. And like we said with DPR, having a damage resistance to a common damage type means your character is having the amount of damage that they're taking, meaning they can take twice the amount of normal punishment from those kind of attacks. Now, in an MMORPG, which is a programmed video game, usually tank characters have some sort of feature or ability that allows them to draw fire through the game's programming. Now, even though Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game, where it's a lot harder and there's more role-playing involved to get the same effect, tanks still have their place in a party's composition. For example, a lot of tank characters have other abilities that force an enemy to prioritize them, or at least acknowledge their role on the battlefield. Are you fighting an enemy caster that loves making ranged spell attacks? It's going to be really hard for them to ignore a barbarian that stays within melee range so that they're making their attacks with disadvantage. And strong tank characters also tend to have strong DPR options, meaning even if an enemy wants to, it's really hard to ignore them, because if they do, it means the battle might be over that much quicker. Examples of efficient classes that tank well include Barbarian, Paladin, and Monk. I know, I've mentioned Paladin twice now, and I haven't mentioned Fighter once. Bear with me. To start off, if we look at the Barbarians class features, they have all of the great features that can make a great tank. Unarmored Defense gives them a self-sufficient, reliable armor class. Constitution is one of their highest prioritized ability scores, and they have the highest hit die in the game to go along with it. And their main feature from first level, Rage, has damage resistances and a little bit of DPR built right into it. Choose Bear Totem Barbarian at 3rd level, and you have 12 out of 13 damage resistances covered. Now moving on to Paladins, they have heavy armor proficiency, meaning it's really easy through their equipment for them to get a competitive armor class right out of the gate. In addition, their aura abilities are excellent support that allow them and their allies to easier succeed on saving throws, meaning even something that's really debilitating or something they're not necessarily strong in, they can still survive the effect caused by an enemy creature. Paladins also get Aura of Protection, giving a boost to all of their throws, meaning that even in the higher levels of play, they're more likely to succeed on those crucial save effects. Now, some of you may have heard me list a monk and kind of gone, huh? But let me explain. Monks don't really make great tanks until they hit 14th level. Now remember, part of how I define a tank's durability is high armor class, which the monk gets at 1st level with unarmored defense. But at 14th level, they get a feature called Diamond Soul, which allows them to be proficient in all saving throws, and that includes death saves. In addition, they get an Indomitable-like effect, where they can spend 1 key point to re-roll a failed saving throw in an attempt to succeed on the second time around. And Evasion is an excellent durability feature monks get at 7th level, which allows them to have the damage of failed dex saves. And dex saves tend to be the most common area of effect damaging effects in 5th edition's design. And their mobility features like unarmored defense and the ability to move across liquids allow them to stay within melee range of an enemy so that it's hard for them to be ignored. Now, the one thing monks are missing are a high hit die and a high constitution modifier, but they have the other ingredients of making an excellent tank, especially toward the end game. I've found with the right build, monk is an excellent recipe for success when it comes to making a tank character. So the next role we have is support. Now, a lot of people substitute this role for healer, as you would in an MMO. Now, the reason I use support instead of healing is because healing isn't always the most efficient option, and support characters usually play a bigger role than just healing, even though healing is a crucial part of the flow of combat. Now, when I talk about a support character, healing does fall under that role's umbrella. However, it also means to strengthen and make your allies better at their jobs. For example, the Bless spell allows your DPR allies to hit more often with their attack rolls, and your tanks to make their saving throws a little more easily. Heroism can keep giving a tank more temporary HP round after round, and also makes them immune to the frightened condition. And of course, healing keeps your allies from dying. Now, I find that a lot of new players that play healing characters feel that they aren't doing their job if they aren't healing round after round. And while that's a mindset that may be encouraged in different video games, I find that in D&D, this is an inefficient route to take. But more on that later. Examples of great support classes include Bard, Cleric, and Druid. Bardic Inspiration gives a targeted buff that allows the player that's inspired to choose when to use that inspiration when they need it. Clerics have a reputation of being great healers in D&D, and they also have some really great support spells that even makes other spellcasters good at their jobs. Spells like Beacon of Hope allow other healers to maximize the amount of healing they can do. And Druids have access to my favorite healing spell, Healing Spirit, which I find to be the most efficient healing spell even after the latest errata. A lot of Druid support options also double as control options, meaning a lot of times they can fulfill 2 roles with 1 action. And that's an excellent segue into our 4th role, which is control. Whereas support characters get their name from the fact that they make their allies better at their jobs, control characters instead force an enemy to reprioritize the choices that it has available. The marks of a great control character include being able to damage multiple enemies at once, impose conditions on enemies like Charmed or Frightened, and change the environment or the rules of the encounter to make it less favorable for the enemy. For example, a Monk's Stunning Strike is something I consider a control ability, because not only does it strip the target of its ability to act and control their behavior, it now forces the enemy team to reprioritize, and maybe they waste an action trying to lesser restoration, or they choose to ignore that ally, which then leads to further complications later on in the combat. Control characters are all about forcing an enemy to make tough choices where there isn't a favorable outcome no matter which route they go. Silence is another example of a great control spell, because what it does is it completely negates the effectiveness of an entire classification of enemy inside a specific area. Quick story for that, I was once a part of a combat where we had a few 6th level party members. I casted Plant Growth, which basically made it so the enemy party couldn't move, and then there was an ally that casted Silence, so all of the enemy spellcasters were unable to be effective at all. Through that combination of control spells, it made a potentially deadly encounter deadly for the enemy. And of course, the ultimate influencer of behavior is damage. If your character can demonstrate that there are certain shapes that are more dangerous for an enemy party to be in because of bigger spells like Fireball or Lightning Bolt, it's going to fundamentally change how enemy units position themselves relative to your party. And that can allow for even bigger setups if your party is sensitive to it. Now, examples of strong control classes include Druid, Monk, and Wizard. But wait, John! There are a lot of classes you haven't even mentioned yet, like Fighter, Ranger, or Sorcerer. What can they do well? Are they just bad classes? The answer is yes! No, I'm just kidding. The classes I chose to highlight are ones that exemplify a role most efficiently that I've experienced both as a player and as a DM. That doesn't mean that the classes that I didn't mention are bad at any of those roles. One reason I might have chose to exclude a class from a particular role is because that class lacks generic abilities that guarantee its effectiveness in that position. For example, I mentioned rogues for DPR because all rogues have access to sneak attack, which is just a generally good DPR ability. But a fighter might be a strong DPR character, and you can build it that way, but each fighter is going to be very unique, and you can build a fighter in so many different ways that it's hard for me to say, like, all good fighters are going to be tanks, or all fighters are going to be good DPR characters. If I didn't mention a class, it probably means there are so many different ways that you can build it that I can't categorize it so easily, or so sweepingly. And it does speak to a hidden 5th role of combat, which is the pivot. Pivot characters, or pivoting players, understand that the 4 roles of combat are fluid, and it's a round-by-round evaluation of what kind of choice your character is going to make. For example, you may have a druid player that in one round decides to opt for support and cast Healing Spirit. But in the next round, they pivot into a control player where they cast the Entangle spell to kind of wrap up a few different goblins and make them unable to act. And you don't have to have each of the roles satisfied every combat or every round. Sometimes it might be most appropriate to have every character deal as much damage as they can in a round. Or sometimes it may be better to play it safe and have one character tank, one character support, 2 characters control, and have nobody on DPR. Some classes are better at pivoting than others, where they can opt between 2, maybe even 3 of these roles in a single combat. Cleric is an excellent example of this kind of pivoting mindset. For example, let's say that your combat starts out by your wizard getting sniped by an assassin and getting dropped to 0 before initiative is even rolled. The cleric may have to immediately go into first aid mode and spend its action economy to do the most amount of points of healing it can to keep that wizard from dying. But in a future round, it might use a spell like Spirit Guardians for a controlled purpose, or it might use a spell like Flame Strike to deal the most amount of damage it can. Another example is Ranger, which a lot of people are dissatisfied with in 5th edition's base design. Now, Dungeon Coach did do this awesome fix for the Ranger, which you can find out in the cards above. But a lot of times I find that players that are dissatisfied with the Ranger misinterpret the class's role in a party's composition. The Ranger isn't the best damage dealer, or the best healer, or the best controller. Instead, its design and its spells allow it to pivot to whatever role it needs to be in most efficiently, even though it's always going to be 2nd or 3rd best in that role. And may I remind you that Healing Spirit is also a Ranger spell? So my challenge to you is when you build your next character, try not to build it for only one role. As just a thought exercise, when you're building your character's features and selecting spells and subclasses, identify what your character's primary role is, what they do most efficiently, but you can also see what they have for a secondary or a tertiary role, so that way if you need to pivot, you can. And not every class is going to give you the ability to fulfill every role. A wizard tends not to learn healing spells, so healer isn't going to be part of their support loadout. But a wizard that's trying to support its allies may make those allies better at their job if it sets up a wall of force, which is also a control spell. So, those are the 4 roles of combat. And now I want to know what you guys think. Was there a combat role that you've seen in play that I didn't mention here? Or did I miss something else about the relationship between the classes and the 4 roles of combat? Hey, big news, big announcement. Our podcast, DM Shower Thoughts, is now available on Apple Podcast. You can take a dive into our full library, both new and old. And it's funny, because you can see the trend of where Adamus and I started as amateurs, how our minds got expanded through conversations of 5th edition, and even when we got to introduce our newest DM Shower Thoughts podcaster, Mr. Ian. So check it out, and remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.